Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
When Nighttime Falls, Volume 7, Story Number 1. Now, this is a story that few people know, but I feel that you might be interested. Back in 2006 until 2007, I was deployed to Iraq. This was obviously a busy time for me, but things didn't seem right in a certain location of my platoon's observation post. This location was the second floor of the guard tower building in our compound in the middle of Tel Afar. At first, it was just a feeling of unease and was just simply dismissed as nerves. Posting in the guard tower wasn't necessarily a safe venture. Then it started to get weird. As I would walk up there, it always felt as though something was rushing upon me, hurrying me out of the second floor of the building, like I was not welcome in any way. This feeling was completely foreign to me, and even though I was already a believer in spirits, I never thought there'd be ghosts or ghostly happenings in the middle of Iraq. I'd figured it'd be too busy to notice it. Then, towards the end of my deployment, it was time to pull one of my last guard shifts in that location. I decided to see how long I could stay on that second floor. Turns out something didn't like me challenging them. Pebbles seemed to be thrown at me while I was waiting on the floor. I never actually saw the pebbles, but the telltale sounds of rocks hitting the concrete around me was ever so present. I never really got out to see any shadows or apparitions, but it still gives me the heebie-jeebies till this day. Story number 2. This happened to a comrade of my school friend when he was in the army. He was stationed at the compound close to the Georgian border, if I remember right. His task was to keep a watch out at the tower. Now the layout was this. It's a tower near a steep hill going down. All around it's covered in pebbles, so if anyone's walking, you'd hear it. That place had some nasty reputation already because there were some strange experiences. So during his shift, he was sitting at the tower alone. Then he started hearing footsteps on a steel staircase under him. He reacted fast, grabbed the gun, pointed at the staircase and shouted, "Halt! Who's there?" Nothing. And the sounds disappeared too. After some time, the same thing happened again, but closer to him. He did the same thing, and the sound stopped. After some time, the sounds came back even closer. And then, after he reacted to it, the sounds disappeared again. And he decided, screw that, and went for a patrol around his area. He was walking on the pebble, and sometimes he would hear someone walking behind him. He would look back, and there was nothing. It kept happening several times, getting closer every time. Then he reached a big lamp overlooking the hill to highlight anyone trying to cross the border. He stood there looking over when someone tapped on his shoulder and said, "Got a smoke?" Without thinking, he just reached for a pack of cigarettes and tried giving it to the voice, but when he turned around, there was nobody there. Nobody could have walked to him. Nobody ran away because the ground was all pebbles. He would have heard it. He was creeped out, but still decided to leave a cigarette under the lamp for a stranger to take. He came back to the tower, and the rest of the night was eventless. In the morning, he came back to check on the lamp, and the cigarette was gone. Next story. I grew up in a late Victorian home in the town of Monroe, Washington. The home was a 2-story with a red brick fireplace and rough-hewn lumber for walls. It had French doors in the living room leading to the heavy lumber porch, and was painted a mustard yellow with brown trim on the exterior. The home sat on 5 wooded acres on a large hill overlooking the Squamish River basin, tucked into the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountain range. A fairly idyllic and mystical place for a young boy to live and grow. I could fill a paperback book with the stories of this place, the kind of book you might pick up at a rural truck stop. Nothing I can write will ever convey the feeling of dread, terror, sadness, and overwhelming joy I felt while living there and experiencing all those things as a young boy. I had been put to bed by my mother in my simple pine wood twin bed, quite safe and sound as I recollect. I remember falling asleep, and I remember waking up some time later. I woke up and shifted position on the bed by crawling under my blanket to the foot of the bed. I peeked out of the blanket and looked across the expansive room to where my brother slept. In the middle of the room, I saw what looked like pillars of dark smoke descending from the ceiling. These pillars descended and formed a circle, moving in a circle and up and down, much like a carousel. I watched this fascinated for maybe a minute when one of the pillars rose out of the circle and into the air it floated over me and descended near the foot of my bed. As it descended, it formed into an old, grizzled apparition of a miner. This apparition had the appearance of an 1800s miner, complete with beard and miner's hat. It formed and put its ghost hands on the bed rail, leaning into and over me, staring at me with an expression that conveyed that cringing sensation you only get when old people get grumpy at you. I was terrified. I attempted to scream, "Mom! Mom!" but only a thin rasp came out of my vocal cords, which seemed to please the apparition. We stayed locked in this terrifying stare down when the lights flickered on and everything disappeared. My mother woke up and walked over to me. She said she hadn't heard me but wanted to check on me. I told her what happened and we prayed, and I finally fell back asleep. After we moved out of the house, we bumped into the landlord at a teriyaki restaurant, Toshi's Teriyaki. He seemed eager to engage my dad in conversation. He began to tell my dad all the horrible facts of the house, which, as I remember, seemed to stop the entire restaurant as they were fully engaged in the story and its clearer details. He began by apologizing. He apologized for not telling us that the home was originally a funeral home for original gold and silver miners and loggers who founded Monroe in the late 1800s. My dad, who was fascinated by history and gold mining, was unfazed and more interested in the story than the fact that we lived in a funeral home all those years. The landlord explained that our living room with the French doors was where the coffins were placed. The double French doors were there to accommodate moving a coffin plus pallbearers into and out of the parlor. The upstairs room, which was my brother and my room, was where the bodies were prepared, and our bathroom was an embalming room. The old claw foot tub was a body fluid basin and soaker, washer, to do all the extra stuff. He assumed that the chemicals used in those days were impregnated into the wood of the walls and floors, and thus explained the tuberculosis my father got, the asthma my brother formed and collapsed one of his lungs, and the extremely rare eye disease which hadn't been seen anywhere since an outbreak which killed children in the late 1800s, which I contracted and put me in a children's hospital for 3 months. He said the reason he never went into the house when he came over to collect rent was that a spirit had appeared to his wife in the kitchen in the form of a woman in a glowing white dress and told her she was a protector. He did not believe it and never set foot in the house again. Let me start by saying that my extended family, whoever came over to visit, only did so once and never returned out of fear of the house. My cousin was sleeping beside my bed facing the window on the upstairs floor. He never slept that night because he said that a pair of glowing red eyes hovered at the window all night staring at him. Many years after I had grown and left the home and formed my own life, I decided to revisit the house I had so many wonderful as well as terrifying memories in. I was with my ex-wife driving through to the eastern part of Washington, where I now live and work. We were taking Highway 2 over Stevens Pass after having been on a fishing trip for the odd-year pink salmon run. We arrived in Monroe, and that old warm childhood glow remained in the town, though it had changed much. I drove to the bottom of the hill where the road up to the house began, and to my surprise it was no longer there. It had been rerouted and the road torn out, so with some difficulty I finally found a way to my old neighborhood. The large forest I had grown up exploring with my brother had been replaced by suburban sprawl. Townhomes, cul-de-sacs, shitty little parks with fresh red bark, and tiny chain-link fenced wetland habitats stood where once there were towering cedars amidst natural springs and alder groves. It was saddening and yet refreshing knowing new life existed where so much pain and fright existed for so long. As I approached the drive to my old house, a rush of memories hit me like a driving rain, and I cried. It was so much to see the old house. The pasture was still there, as was the fence we put in for the pony and goat we had. Mom's garden existed, but was largely unattended and overgrown. But amidst the memories stood the old yellow Victorian, silent, quiet, like a neutral sentinel harboring the horrors of demonic and ghostly activities that had branded itself into the living conscience of so many families. I gazed at it through the cracked windshield of my blue Honda Civic hatchback. I slowly drove down the old gravel path to see if anyone might be home. No cars, no people. For sale. The sign hung on the hangman's type realtor pole. Brochure, I grabbed an informational brochure and went over the details. Patina period brass fixtures throughout, historical fireplace, well, I guess I can't argue facts. I walked into the porch, and the groan of the wood brought back a flood of memories. I shook it off and approached the door. It had a large realtor's lock on the handle. I peered inside, and it still looked exactly the same, right down to the hideous calico shag carpet. My ex-wife was feeling creeped out, so I got back into the Civic where she waited, and we drove down the road past the house and then turned around. As we drove past the old bay window, I slowed the car to almost a halt. Inside the house on the stairs stood a woman with a 19th century dark-colored dress on. Her hair was up, and her hand was on the handrail that hadn't existed for a long time. She stared directly at me. I continued driving without saying anything. The house won't affect me anymore. But before I forget, there was another story of what happened when I was a kid living in that house. My mother had a close friend back then named Debbie. Debbie would come over often, and the two of them would have Bible studies together or sing or just visit. One night Debbie came over, and her and my mom were having a Bible study on Mom's bed. Debbie never left that night and chose to stay. This was right in the middle of my episode of having a rare eye disease which blinded that eye for a long time and made me a study item for university med students. The disease hadn't been recorded since the late 1800s, so my treatment was groundbreaking in that it saved my life and my eye. The next day, I recall Debbie seemed very tired. I was receiving a large dose of liquid medicine from our house nurse. This medicine was injected into a stent which led to a heart pick line, which literally meant the medicine was forced directly to my heart. I remember I could taste the medicine even though it never touched my mouth. Debbie was there, and she was praying very earnestly over me. She prayed that the scales be lifted from his, as in my eyes. Afterwards, she explained that she never left the night before because during their Bible study, a lizard man with large scales kept walking through the walls of the upstairs as though on patrol. She was terrified but felt the Lord Jesus command her to stay and pray and trust in him. So she did the next day. After having not slept but watched a ghostly lizard man walk the upstairs all night, she prayed over me for healing. I healed eventually after many ups and downs, but my sight was restored. Then there was an old trailer that had been built into a shed on the property. It was filled with old stuff. In a room behind glass-paned doors was stored the belongings of someone from a very long time ago. I'm just getting chills to thinking about it. So me and two of my friends were exploring, and I looked into this room, which was barely lit by the outside sunlight streaming through the dirty shed windows. Propped up and facing us was a large painting of what looked like a demon or a large monster in hell. The monster was in a classic Scooby-Doo arms raised monster pose, but it was terrifying to look at. The background was hellish and dark and made my heart hurt even recalling that damn thing. The painting had a semi-ornate gold-leafed frame that was very dirty and smudged. I went outside, and my mom was tending to the chickens and gardening, and I told her about the painting. She seemed a little amused, but also a little disturbed simultaneously. I wanted her to look at it. I led her by the hand into the shed and to the glass-paned door to look inside. We both looked through the dirty glass, and lo and behold, the painting was gone. It was the least terrifying thing to occur there, but it still frightens me to this day. Next story. When my mother was young, in the late 1950s, she was given a Patty Play Pal doll. The fact in itself is not so alarming, but as my grandfather was in the Air Force and the family moved around a fair amount, the doll was lost in transition, and my mother never saw it again until the passing of my grandmother in October of 1984. Following the funeral, my mother and aunt gathered at my grandmother's house, now home to my aunt, and began to clean out closets and distribute family heirlooms between them. I was just 9 years old at the time and was sitting quietly in the living room, watching TV and half trying to understand the entire adult situation. This was the first death I'd experienced, and while I understood it, I wasn't sure how to handle it just yet. "Oh my God," came a cry from my mom, who was rifling through the hot closet just around the corner from the living room. "What?" cried my aunt, who was taking a rest on a chair nearby. "Look," replied my mom, and she pulled out a pillowcase wrapped in belts with 2 feet sticking out from the opening. "Patty!" My mom was elated. Belts were unbuckled, and the pillowcase was stripped away, revealing a near-mint condition, life-size doll that looked stunningly like a 6-year-old girl with pale skin and brown hair. Instantly, I was terrified. The arms had been removed, and they were loose inside the pillowcase, but my mom popped them back into their sockets and brought the doll into the living room, bending her hips and letting her sit directly across from me, her head tilted off, looking back towards the closet from which she came. This was my doll, my mom told me, and explained how she'd been lost for decades. Even at 9 years old, I wondered to myself, how was she lost for decades? She was obviously in that closet, right? Why those belts and the pillowcase? After the excitement diminished, my mother and aunt went back to their business. Meanwhile, I sat very still, the doll sitting directly across from me, looking back at her recent tomb. My mother's voice faded off, and the two of them disappeared into a back room. I couldn't move. I couldn't catch my breath. The doll was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. She should have been innocuous, but this toy created an absolute anxiety in me, and then she turned to face me. Her head twisted slowly on its pivot, and in seconds she was face to face with me and appeared to be smiling widely. "Mom!" My mom came running. My aunt was right behind her. "What?" "She's looking at me." "So?" She turned her head, and she's looking at me." "Tommy, she's a doll. Don't be silly. Be careful with her. She's old, and she's liable to fall apart if you touch her." "I didn't touch her." I tried explaining, but the adults went back to their business, and the doll continued to stare. We returned home to Charleston after a few days. The doll came too. My mother set her up at the foot of the stairs so that when you were coming downstairs and turned on the landing, you saw her standing there, waiting for your arrival. This didn't last long because I refused to pass by her. For a long time I had nightmares about the doll, terrifying dreams in which she was coming after me. Once in a while I was convinced I hadn't been dreaming and would beg my mom to get rid of her. She wouldn't. But after years of this fear, my mother relented and stored the doll in the back of her bedroom closet. The closet wasn't deep, but it had lots of room to either side of the doors, 4 or 5 feet in either direction for storage. The doll was kept in the furthest corner of the closet, where I was promised I would never have to see her. During my senior year of high school, I was home alone one early evening. I was getting ready for a night of hanging out with friends and had just finished with my shower. Standing in the bathroom, door shut, towel on, I finished drying my hair when I heard the door to my mother's bedroom door click open. I froze. Soft footprints crept along the carpeted hallway out of her room and past the bathroom door. They continued into the dining room, and as the carpet ended and was replaced by the linoleum of the kitchen, the sound became a light slap slap, as though tiny feet were finding their way around the room. Don't breathe. The sound of drawers opened slowly, and then the tinkling of silverware. Jesus, it's her. She's got a knife. I literally thought in my panic that the doll had spent years planning for this very moment and had escaped the closet, had snuck past the bathroom to get a knife in an attempt to kill me like so many horror movies. Then, the sound of the drawer slowly sliding closed. Tiny feet along the linoleum, tiny feet across the carpet, past the bathroom. The door to my mother's bedroom thudded shut. She's out there. She's not hiding. She wants me to think she is, but she's out there with a knife ready to kill me. I'm not proud of the fear that swallowed me in that moment, but it was there. I just knew that a lifetime of terror had amounted to this. I stood perfectly still for what felt like an hour, but should only have been a moment. I decided that I had heard everything that I had thought I heard, and that accusing the doll was a stupid childhood fear. But the sounds were real, and someone had made them. Someone must have gone into the house while I was in the shower. I had to get out before this real person hurt me. I calculated my escape, and since there were no windows, I knew I had to go through the bathroom door. Arming myself with a hairdryer and a disposable razor, I threw the door open, hoping the surprise would halt any attack long enough for me to make a move. But no one was there. I looked down both ends of the hallway, and no one was anywhere. Dropping the hairdryer and razor, I hurried to the left, toward the dining room where a pile of laundry sat on the dining room table. I grabbed what I could and ducked into the living room and hid in the far side of the couch, under an end table. Ring, ring. The phone was sitting in its cradle above me. Flashbacks of the call is coming from inside the house struck me, but I decided not answering the phone would somehow be worse. Carefully to avoid being seen, I reached my hand up and grabbed the cordless, whispering into it, "Hello?" Tommy, it was Sam, one of my friends with whom I was supposed to be heading to see. Instead of meeting at Jay's, we're going to go to... "There's somebody in my house," I interrupted. "What?" "There's somebody in my house, Sam." "Get out," she insisted. "I'm calling the police." I hung up on Sam and, dreading the idea of heading back into that hallway, got up my courage and headed into the danger zone, through the kitchen. I couldn't look back down the hallway toward the bathroom and my mom's room, but I could feel something or someone down there, and they were pissed. Throwing open the kitchen door, I stumbled down the steps into the carport and fumbled with my keys, desperate to get into my car. The carport's light came on. They were not motion activated. They had to be turned on from inside the house. So I looked up, and there in the 9-pane window of the kitchen door was a silhouette of a person, child-sized, all in black, staring at me. I got in my car and drove to the entrance of the street and waited for help. The police found nothing. No forced entry, no evidence of anyone being inside the home. Nothing. They elbowed one another, presumably an inside joke about the scrawny teenager who scared himself. I met up with Sam and the others afterward and eventually calmed down. But the event was not isolated, and a few weeks later played out again in almost exact detail. I refused to be at home alone from then on. If no one was around, neither was I. Happily, I left for college a short time later, and after a few years, I had nearly forgotten about the doll. And then I came home for a visit one weekend. Up the steps from the carport and through the kitchen door, I didn't see anyone around. "Mom?" "Back here," she shouted from the end of the hall. I wandered down the hallway that I had once hated and entered my mom's bedroom. She was sitting on the floor with the doll standing in front of her, facing away. She had slipped two pillowcases over the doll and was buckling several belts tightly around it. "What are you doing?" I asked. She stamped out a cigarette. Oh, nothing." "Liar," I said jokingly. I preferred not knowing at this point. She finished buckling it up and tucked it back into the far side corner of the closet, 4 or 5 feet out of sight. But several weeks later, when I was again home for a short visit, my mom asked, "Remember when I was wrapping Patty up?" "Yeah." "I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" I asked. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you about it." She looked upset but attempted a smile. "Okay, I give. What happened? Why did you wrap her up like when we found her?" She went on to explain that the night before I showed up, she had had a vivid dream in which she met an old woman who was carrying a young girl. The old woman approached her and asked, "Can you keep her safe?" My mom said, "Of course," and took the girl into her arms. At this point, she recognized the little girl as the very same doll, but alive. "Go," the old woman barked, and my mom took off with the girl in her arms as fast as she could. Suddenly, a phone booth was in her path, and it rang loudly. Holding the girl, she said she had to make a decision. "If I don't answer it, it'll be worse than if I do." It struck me that this was exactly how I felt when Sam had called me so many years before. She picked up the phone, and a gingerly voice said, "Hello?" A rasping, guttural, and angry answered. "We will find her." At that, she slammed the phone down and woke up. She continued, "When I woke up, I was shaking. I sat on the edge of the bed and lit a cigarette." She did this in real time as she told the story, and as I did, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned slowly to the closet door and saw that it was open. Just a foot or so, and there, leaning out as though she was eavesdropping, was Patty. Please tell me you're lying, I said. I'm not. It took me a minute to realize what I was seeing. Once I did, I walked out of the room and spent the rest of the night awake in the living room watching TV. You saw what happened the next day. I bundled her up and put her away. My mother had finally, after nearly 15 years, confirmed my fears. The doll was not right. Had my grandmother known all those years before and trapped it? Is that why it vanished for so long, only to reappear once her control over it had dissipated? We'll likely never know. Next story. Last summer, my husband, for the story I'll call him Doug as he doesn't like his name on the internet, and I had a weekend with no kids. My mom wanted to take our son and two daughters for the weekend, and hubby had a couple days vacation from work, so we decided to go on a much-needed camping trip. There's a local island called McNabb's Island that was a fully functioning military base around 150 years ago and was owned by a family, the McNabb family, but has since been turned into a small local tourist spot. They have walking trails, old barracks, cannons, a bunch of crazy and amazing stuff to see. There's even a family graveyard on the island where many, if not all, of the McNabb family were buried once they passed on. Doug is a World War I and World War II nut, so when he found out we could camp there overnight, he jumped at the chance. We had been to the island during the day, but never at night, since it was known to be haunted, and I'm a huge baby when it comes to ghosts and stuff. But I love my husband, and he does stuff he doesn't want to with me, so I gave in and we went. We got to the island around 6 p.m. The sun was going down, but we had time to set up camp and get settled before it got too dark. Since it's technically a national park, we weren't allowed to have a fire, which made it all that much more creepy, as we were basically in the dark. We stayed up until around 11:30 listening to the waves crash on the beach, playing cards, laughing, and listening to music on my phone when suddenly Doug grabbed my hand and said, "Shh, did you hear that? I think I heard someone singing." At this point, I started to freak out because I am a big believer in the paranormal, and the guy who brought us over told us there was no one else on the island. We were the only ones there that night. He's a friend of ours and had no reason to lie. He's a very honest person anyway, so I know there was no one else there. I paused the music, listened, and didn't hear anything, and tried to convince Doug and myself that it was the wind blowing through the cannons making noise. We had heard it earlier, and it almost sounded like a moan and scared the crap out of us. About an hour later, we both had to pee, but didn't want to walk the 15 minutes in the pitch blackness past the old barracks to the bathroom. So we agreed we'd go outside the tent together and pee, then go back in and go to sleep. I did my business, took the flashlight, and held it for Doug. As he was doing his thing, I shined the flashlight up the trail to see what's around, as we were at the very end, camped next to a brick wall, and get a chance to explore before it got dark. When I saw a couple of white trees swaying in the wind. The wind was quite strong, and the way they swayed was almost hypnotic. I heard Doug say he was done, so I snapped out of it and I eagerly jumped back into the tent. Neither one of us slept much that night. I had the weirdest dream that night about 3 kids around the age of 7 to 10 coming into our tent. They came in saying they were police, of all things, and demanded to know what we were doing on the island. My husband explained that we were just camping, playing cards, and enjoying some quiet time away from the city. I woke up and had a "what the" moment. As I was about to get up and have a cigarette, Doug rolled over and asked if I was awake. We had woken up at the same time. Then, that in itself weirded me out. We had a smoke, cuddled, and fell back into a very broken sleep. 45 minutes later, I checked the time on my phone because it felt like hours. I woke up and was about to fall back asleep when I heard the sound of a woman singing. I sat up and Doug was already awake and up. He looked at me and said, "Tell me you heard it that time." It was definitely not the wind. I couldn't pick out the words, but it was clearly a woman's voice singing a soft melody. We decided to just stay up and wait for daybreak. After what felt like 10 hours, the sun came up. We got out to pee, get some breakfast, and stretch. I looked down the path that I had shined the light down last night to scope out the land in the light, and there were no trees. Not one tree. There was a path, a couple of cannons off to the side that we had seen yesterday, and the barracks, but no white trees. I asked Doug about them, and he looked in confusion, saying he had seen them as well, swaying in the wind the night before. At this point, I am done. I'm scared. I'm in full-blown panic mode, and I'm ready to go home. We called our friend who runs a taxi boat to take people to and from and asked him to come get us. We packed our bags as quickly as we could and started to walk to the beach to be picked up. The walk back was quiet. We were both shaken by the previous night's festivities and not saying much, so I decided to break the silence. I mentioned the weird dream I had. I barely had the word "kids" came into our tent when Doug stopped me and said, "3 of them? A boy and 2 girls? Playing cops?" I stopped walking and looked him in the eye. "How did you know that?" Is all I could manage to get out. I had the same dream. At this point, I am losing my mind with anxiety, but I had to stop to pee. I urinated a lot when I panicked. Good old mom bladder. I went off the path and stumbled onto the graveyard we had heard about. This thing was about 100 feet from where we had slept. I was speechless. When I finally found my voice, I called out to Doug. He came back quickly, as he thought I was hurt due to the shrill squeak I let out, and stopped dead in his tracks. Pun not intended. We had walked past it the night before and hadn't even noticed it. We were too afraid to look and see if there were any boys and girls buried there, though we were 100% sure there were, as it was later confirmed that a few kids were buried there. We just kept walking. We got to the beach and our friend, I'll call him Jake, was waiting for us. He asked us how it was, and the look I gave him said it all. Jake laughed and asked how we liked Crash Cove, which is the place where most people go to camp and party. We told him we didn't make it that far before it got dark. We camped by the second barrack by the graveyard. Jake paused for a second and looked over at Doug. He said, "You know that's basically the most haunted part of the island, right?" I almost passed out right there on the beach. I told him everything we heard, saw, and experienced. He said it's a common occurrence at night when you stay where we did. I have vowed never to go back again, not even during the day. I told Doug, if you want to take the kids, I won't be going. I still don't know what to make of it, but it was definitely an experience I'll never forget.